Viktor Frankl was an Austrian Jewish psychiatrist, neurologist, and Holocaust survivor. In the 1920s and 30s, he did a lot of work on mental health and suicide prevention. He gained international recognition in 1931 when not a single student in Vienna committed suicide that year. He found that people have a variety of things, a collection of things from which they get a sense of meaning and purpose in life. Things like health or wealth or family or friends or work or faith. But during the Second World War, as a prisoner of the Nazis, going from concentration camp to concentration camp, Frankl found that many of these things were gone and replaced instead by extreme suffering. And he saw many people give up on life and choose suicide in one form or another. But Viktor Frankl also saw many other people maintain hope and continue to fight for their lives. And his big question was why? Why do some people have hope and others despair? And more importantly, how can we give hope to those who are in despair? He ran a suicide watch with his fellow prisoners, for his fellow prisoners, and after surviving the Holocaust, he presented his answer to this question in his famous book, Man's Search for Meaning, which he later summarized in a formula. D equals S minus M. Despair is suffering without meaning. Meaning, in other words, I think the way that we often think about suffering is wrong. I think we often think about suffering like it's a liquid. Like the question between hope and despair is about how much suffering it is that we're facing, that if it can be contained in that cup, we can maintain hope, but once it overflows, we're into despair. But that is not what Viktor Frankl found. He said that suffering is not like a liquid, but it's like a gas. That whatever the amount, it can fill a room. And more importantly, it means it's not the amount of suffering that someone faces that determines whether they have hope or despair. Whether it's the relatively lesser but still real suffering, say, of a breakup, or the extreme suffering of a Nazi concentration camp. What makes the difference between hope and despair is not the amount of suffering, but whether or not someone has a sense of meaning and purpose in the face of their suffering. And as Leah shared, Viktor Frankl survived the Holocaust with the firm conviction that it is always possible to find meaning and purpose in life, even in the face of extreme suffering. Now, I've shared Viktor Frankl's experience and insights with thousands of people over the last 8 years in trying to change hearts and minds on assisted suicide, because we have a problem. The problem is that our society accepts euthanasia and thinks that it's okay. The organizations that I'm affiliated with, the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform and Toronto Right to Life, we are educational human rights organizations, pro-life organizations working in the educational arm of the movement, where our focus is to take the pro-life message straight to the people in defiance of the culture of death, and to bring that message in a way that can change hearts and minds, that can make euthanasia unthinkable, that can change what people think about it. And in order to change hearts and minds, we need to identify the cognitive dissonance and the cultural common ground. On the euthanasia issue, the cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is where you hold two conflicting beliefs inside one skull. The cognitive dissonance of our culture right now is that we believe in both suicide prevention and in suicide promotion. And Larry mentioned that that we developed these apologetics on university campuses. This is not formal research. This was in the laboratories of the street. What we did for a year and a half, what we continue to do, is what we've been doing on the abortion issue for 2 decades, is taking the message straight to the people. But we took the best arguments that we could find against euthanasia and assisted suicide and brought them to the laboratories of the street, the University of Toronto, at the university formerly known as Ryerson, brought them into high school classrooms in the Greater Toronto area. And some of these arguments worked really well, and we kept them. Other arguments did not reach the people we were trying to reach. And there were other arguments we didn't think of in advance that we came up with while we were on the streets, while we were sharing successes and failures in conversation. We developed street-tested apologetics in order to change hearts and minds on the issue of euthanasia and assisted suicide. Now, that's a mouthful, euthanasia and assisted suicide. So it is common that, as Alex explained the technical differences between them, but it's common when we're talking about it, we'll just pick one term to use the terms interchangeably, like euthanasia. As we started talking to people about the issue, when we're talking about the morality and the ethics, we shifted to focusing on the term assisted suicide. Because what is it that the other side doesn't want to talk about? Right? We've gone from assisted suicide to assisted dying to medical aid in dying to a cute acronym like MAID. Euphemisms to avoid addressing the suicide issue. The problem is that our society believes, many people in our society believes, that there is a right to die. We can talk about the slippery slope, and that is real. However, if someone believes there's a right to die, the best we can do when talking about the risks is have a conversation about safeguards. We can talk about the corrosive effects on the institutions of law and medicine when we are killing our citizens and our patients. But in our society, so focused on individual rights, people believe there's a right to die. The individual rights will trump the societal concerns every time. We need to be able to address the notion, to debunk the notion that there's a right to die. The cognitive dissonance is around suicide prevention and suicide promotion, and that's also where we have cultural common ground. That is a belief in suicide prevention. So when we start a conversation on the streets or in the classroom about assisted suicide, we'll ask a few simple questions. What do you think about assisted suicide? The average person will share some circumstances in which they think it is okay. Next question. What do you think about suicide? And we get very different responses. People talk about mental health and the need to provide better support. And then we get to the key question at the heart of the apologetics. If someone is suicidal, how do we decide whether to give them suicide prevention or suicide assistance? It brings that tension of the cognitive dissonance right out to the surface so that we can appeal to the cultural common ground of suicide prevention and make a case based on the belief in human equality that everyone deserves an equal right to suicide prevention. Now, when we ask this question, who gets suicide prevention, who gets suicide assistance, because these are opposite things, there are really only 3 possible answers. Either everyone gets suicide assistance, everyone has a right to die. Everyone gets suicide prevention, the pro-life position, or that some people get assistance and some people get prevention. So against this total choice position that everyone should have a right to die, we can ask some simple questions. Is suicide ever a tragedy? Is it ever a bad thing? Should we ever prevent it? Because if everybody truly has a right to die, then suicide prevention wouldn't be a thing. So when people take that extreme position, our goal is to split it, to find some cases of common ground where we can agree that suicide prevention is the answer. And then when we get to the middle case, which is a belief that most people hold in society, most people who support assisted suicide support it in some cases, but they support suicide prevention in other cases. Here, what we call the split position, it splits people into two classes: those whose lives we would unconditionally defend and those whose lives we're willing to end. Those we think are better off alive and those we think are better off dead. And Alex explained how this belief in equality and against discrimination has been used to expand assisted suicide. But in conversation, we can appeal to that belief against discrimination and for equality to make the case for suicide prevention. That everyone has an equal right to suicide prevention. And when we split people into two classes and create second-class citizens, it's usually the elderly and people with disabilities who get the short end of the stick. And we can expose that ableism, that ageism, using simple questions. At the University of Toronto, I was talking to a student and asked what he thought about assisted suicide. He says, I think it should be okay in some cases. I said, what kinds of circumstances? He said, well, what if somebody is 80 years old, they have early onset Alzheimer's, and they're quadriplegic? And I said I could see how that would be a very challenging situation to be in. What if somebody was 80 years old, had early onset Alzheimer's, and they were not quadriplegic? And the students started talking to me about mental health support and how there's actually help and support for Alzheimer's, especially in the early stages. And I pointed out to the student, I said, you see what you just did there? Two people in very similar situations, but one of them is in a wheelchair, the other is not. And the person in the wheelchair, you're talking about assisting suicide. Whereas the person who's not, you're talking about suicide prevention and mental health support. And I could share so many conversations like this where simple questions can expose the ableism and people, and it works for ageism as well when we compare people who are older to people who are younger and the instincts to suicide prevention when we're dealing, say, with teen depression. And we forget everything we know about mental health when we're dealing with people who face turbulent times at other stages in life. Asking a few simple questions and bringing to the surface this ableism and ageism makes so many people I've talked to very uncomfortable with the beliefs they just comfortably shared a few minutes earlier. Simple questions that can make a huge difference to change public opinion, and then we share a little bit about what the pro-life position is and about what it isn't. If D equals S minus M, if despair is suffering without meaning, then meaning and purpose are the antidote to suicidal despair. Now, I just have a brief time here to introduce you to the apologetics, but tested on the streets and in the classroom, these arguments work. The last time I was giving presentations in a GTA classroom in Woodbridge, just two examples. We give the students feedback forms. They can rate their view on a scale of 0 to 10, where 10 is completely pro-life. I had one student who went from a 5 to a 10, who said, before the presentation, I don't know whether it's good or bad. And after the presentation, he said, telling someone to kill themselves is wrong, and so is assisting with it. There was another student who went from a 4 to an 8, and she said, before the presentation, I supported assisted suicide in certain circumstances. I thought it was okay. After the presentation, I changed my view on euthanasia because it made me realize that killing is never okay. Before a presentation, we take a classroom that's 25% generally pro-life, 7 out of 10 or higher, and we bring that to 50% generally pro-life by the end of a presentation. Before a presentation, 12% of students say they're 10 out of 10 pro-life. Afterwards, it's 20% that say they're pro-life. So these arguments work. We've seen them work on the streets, in the classroom, and we've seen doctors and people on the Hill pick up these arguments and use them. So if you're interested in learning about the apologetics, we have the book that I co-authored with my colleague, A Guide to Discussing Assisted Suicide, for sale at the red table in the other room, and it's just for $10. I don't receive any money from the sale of the books. We're offering it as a resource to equip you to be able to change hearts and minds so that we can defy this culture of death and turn this thing around. Thank you.